Life in a roaring camp during the California Gold Rush. Hey, everyone, welcome to the Bedside Chronicles. Tonight we're drifting back to a time of dust, dreamers, and dirt under the fingernails. California, 1849, the so-called Golden State, though at this point, it was more like a large, sunburned patchwork of hope and mud. So dim the lights, adjust your blanket, and allow yourself to imagine a world where the phrase, striking it rich, mostly meant you had learned to tolerate lice, unpredictable weather, and the occasional drunk with a rusty pickaxe. Life in the gold rush wasn't glamorous. Not really. It's easy to romanticize the story. Shiny nuggets, sudden wealth, endless opportunities. In reality, the golden dream was usually accompanied by dust storms, hunger, and the faint odor of unwashed bodies. And of course, the constant possibility of someone pointing at your tent, whispering, "He's probably dead in a ditch by now," which, statistically, wasn't far from the truth. These camps were famously chaotic. They called them roaring for a reason, not because of literal roaring, although the occasional fight or stampede of exhausted miners did resemble a small, disgruntled lion pride. No, it was a metaphor for noise, chaos, and the general clamorous energy of people who had crossed half a continent for a speck of yellow rock. Imagine a patchwork of tents, shanties, and hastily built wooden shacks, each one precariously leaning, and you get the basic layout of most settlements. Streets were muddy, smells were questionable, and sanitation was, well, let's just say it was largely an abstract concept. The population in these camps was overwhelmingly male, which might explain some of the daily theatrics. Young men, old men, men who looked like they hadn't seen a comb in a decade. They were all here for the same reason, gold. And yet, even among them, hierarchy emerged. Not the noble kind, not the kind dictated by lineage or education. No, here, power was mostly about who could swing a pickaxe faster, drink more whiskey, or occasionally, lie more convincingly about having found a nugget the size of your fist. Speaking of whiskey, it was central to camp life. The average miner carried a small flask as religiously as any monk might carry a prayer book. It wasn't just about inebriation. It was about warmth, courage, and the illusion of companionship. Miners would often gather around a makeshift fire after a long day, swapping tales of almost struck riches, elaborate exaggerations, and occasional threats, all delivered in a tone that suggested, naturally, that the next argument might end in a duel or bar fight. Food, or rather the approximation of food, was another adventure. Miners subsisted largely on beans, salted pork, and whatever they could catch or trade for, which was rarely much. Fresh produce was scarce, unless someone had a garden or a traveling merchant. So, the typical meal involved a lot of chewing, a lot of thirst, and an impressive ability to ignore the lingering aroma of yesterday's provisions. Some claimed that the food contributed to a certain resilience, though it's more likely that it simply hardened their palates, if nothing else. Life in these camps also had its moments of ritualized absurdity. Take, for example, the process of staking a claim. There were rules, loosely enforced, naturally, about who had rights to a given section of land. Miners would mark off plots with sticks, rocks, or occasionally, a shouting contest. Disputes were frequent. Sometimes they were settled with logic. More often, they were settled with fists. knives, or a dramatic exit followed by weeks of passive-aggressive territorial signage. And when gold was found, the camp would erupt in noise, shouts, hammers, and the occasional panicked suggestion that the whole world was suddenly watching. It wasn't all fighting and chaos, of course. Occasionally, you'd find people attempting civility. There were makeshift schools, temporary churches, and the rare instance of a miner who decided that law and order, even if fleeting, might improve everyone's quality of life. These attempts at civilization were admirable, if doomed, because the fundamental truth of the gold rush was that it thrived on instability. A sense of permanence was practically an affront to the spirit of the place. Women were rare, which had its own social consequences. Those who arrived were often wives, laundresses, cooks, or entertainers, though sometimes all four at once. Their presence, naturally, could elevate the moral tone slightly, though it more often provoked jealousy, gossip, or inexplicable arguments over who got the last clean dish. And when women weren't around, the camps often became theaters of absurdity, exaggerated bravado, attempts at songwriting, or poetry written on scraps of whatever paper was available. It was a mix of genuine expression and desperate attempts to fill the quiet hours of labor with something other than exhaustion. Speaking of labor, let's pause to consider the work itself. Gold mining was tedious, exhausting, and deeply unrewarding for most. Miners dug in rivers, panned in cold water, and sifted through dirt, mud, and gravel for hours, often with nothing to show for it except blisters and mild hypothermia. The promise of wealth was always just out of reach. Sometimes, the gold revealed itself, glinting in a riverbed, and the lucky miner would suddenly become the object of envious stares, exaggerated stories, and a subtle shift in the social hierarchy of the camp. But for the majority, the day ended with nothing except tired hands and the realization that the earth was unyielding and the sun merciless. Despite the hardships, miners developed systems of entertainment, however minimal. Card games were popular, as were simple songs, storytelling, and occasional makeshift dances. Often, these activities were more about passing the time than genuine amusement. There was also gambling, which was less a matter of strategy and more a ritual of hope and despair played out with coins, rocks, or occasionally, a particularly bold turn of a pan. Illness was common, and medical knowledge was, predictably, rudimentary. Minor injuries could become life-threatening. Fever and dysentery were persistent companions, and yet, in a curious display of optimism, or perhaps denial, miners continued to labor, eat questionable food, and engage in social theatrics as though illness were a minor inconvenience. In some ways, this was a form of quiet heroism, though it looked more like stubbornness to anyone observing from a distance. Let's drift over to the law, or the lack thereof. Gold Rush camps had a kind of democratic chaos, where rules were made, broken, and ignored with equal fervor. Vigilante justice was common, though often more theatrical than effective. Someone accused of theft might be paraded through the camp, given a mild scolding, or occasionally dunked in a river. The more serious disputes could end badly, but these were exceptions rather than rules. For the most part, life operated on a delicate balance of mutual suspicion, occasional camaraderie, and the tacit understanding that the gold was more important than justice. Travel and communication were slow, which gave the camps a strange sense of temporal isolation. Letters from home were rare, delayed, or often lost entirely. News from the outside world arrived sporadically, and by the time it reached a miner, it was often outdated, garbled, or profoundly irrelevant to the task of separating flecks of gold from river silt. In this sense, life in a gold rush camp was both intensely local and curiously timeless, as if the outside world had momentarily forgotten these settlements existed. Currency and trade had their own peculiarities. Gold dust was often weighed on delicate scales, with disputes about measurement causing arguments, quiet threats, and occasional fistfights. Bartering was common, especially for food, clothing, and the odd luxury like coffee or tobacco. And yet, even in these primitive economic systems, social hierarchies emerged, driven by luck, cunning, and occasionally sheer audacity. Evening in the camps brought a shift in energy. Work slowed, fires were lit, and the collective exhaustion of the day settled over tents like a heavy blanket. Conversations became quieter, storytelling more repetitive, and the occasional laugh more brittle than the day before. The night, however, was rarely truly peaceful. Animals prowled, the occasional criminal lurked, and the general discomfort of sleeping on uneven ground with minimal bedding reminded everyone that comfort was a luxury rarely afforded here. Sleep itself was a challenge. Miners often rested in cramped tents or on the ground, wrapped in thin blankets or whatever cloth they could find. The sounds of the camp persisted: snoring, murmured conversations, distant arguing, and the occasional panicked shout. Dreams were likely haunted by visions of the next day's labor, the elusive glint of gold, and the faint hope that one day, just maybe, all this dust, sweat, and discomfort might yield something resembling fortune. And yet, despite all of this, the mud, the chaos, the exhaustion, life in the gold rush had its charms. There was a peculiar solidarity among those who labored together, a shared understanding that misery was more tolerable when mutual. Friendships, alliances, and grudging respect were formed in the crucible of shared hardship, and occasionally, when the sun struck a river just right, or a small nugget appeared in the pan, there was a fleeting, almost magical sense of triumph, proof that hope, however fragile, was not entirely wasted. So, as we drift through the memory of these roaring camps, it's worth noting that the California gold rush was less a story of riches and more a story of endurance, of people who, driven by hope or desperation or sheer boredom with ordinary life, found themselves in a world that was loud, dusty, and occasionally absurd. They scratched, dug, and argued, and in doing so, became part of a strange, restless chapter of history that seems almost dreamlike from the comfort of a warm bed. And with that, let's settle into the quiet observation of these camps. Imagine the flicker of firelight across faces tired from a day of labor, the distant clatter of pans, the low murmur of conversations blending with the occasional bark or the whisper of wind through the dust. It's chaotic, yes, but also quietly alive in a way that makes modern life, comfortable beds, hot showers, instant communication, seem almost unreal. Tomorrow, the same sun will rise, dust will settle in new patterns, and miners will once again descend upon riverbeds with hopes, hands, and hearts in equal measure. And that, in its soft, relentless way, is the rhythm of a gold rush camp. End of part 1. Part 2. The Invisible Army of Bletchley Park. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting over to England, the early 1940s, and a world slightly less dusty than a gold rush camp, but equally chaotic in its own peculiar way. This time, instead of men swinging picks and squinting at riverbeds, we find ourselves among the low hum of typewriters, the soft click of machines, and the faint, constant sense of urgency that accompanies a world at war. Welcome to Bletchley Park, the home of what history would later call the Invisible Army. The Invisible Army, of course, wasn't a conventional army. There were no marching drills, no bugles, no long columns of soldiers trudging through mud. Instead, this army consisted largely of women, tens of thousands of them, sitting in quiet rooms, tapping at typewriters, decoding messages, and carrying the immense, invisible weight of a war effort that would remain a secret for 30 years. It is tempting, when you first hear the story, to imagine Bletchley Park as some glamorous, high-stakes operation, but the reality was, naturally, a little less like a spy thriller, and a little more like a very intense, endlessly tedious office. The women were young, mostly in their 20s, though some were older, recruited from universities, offices, and secretarial pools. Their jobs varied. Some operated the bomb machines, the complex electromechanical devices designed to help unravel the German Enigma codes. Others worked as clerks, analysts, translators, or statisticians, combing through mountains of intercepted communications that, without context, were as unintelligible as a cat walking across a keyboard. And yet, in this routine, in this endless sorting and typing, lay the very essence of their contribution. Because the work was invisible, it was unglamorous, and it was painstaking. One woman might spend an entire day tracing a single pattern, fingers stiff from the relentless rhythm of typing and transcribing. Another might sit for hours operating a machine that whirred, clanked, and occasionally sparked in a mild but alarming display of enthusiasm, all while maintaining the illusion of effortless competence. Discipline was the backbone of Bletchley Park, not the kind of discipline one might associate with a military barracks, with harsh punishments or shouted orders. No, this was the quiet, relentless discipline of secrecy. Everyone was sworn to absolute silence. One could, in theory, speak to the next roommate, friend, or parent about anything, except, naturally, about work. That was off limits. Discussion of codes, of machines, of decrypts, of daily progress, of the very fact that they existed in such a place, forbidden, and the women adhered to this rule with astonishing fidelity. It was, in its own subtle way, heroic. Imagine, if you will, spending your days helping to shorten a war, to save thousands of lives, and being unable to tell your family, friends, or neighbors anything meaningful about it. Not even a hint. You could talk about the weather. You could mention that you were typing a lot. You could complain about your shoes. But the actual work, your quiet triumphs and frustrations, remained locked inside you for years, decades. It is tempting to underestimate the difficulty of this. Humans, after all, are storytellers by nature. We want to share our victories, our clever solutions, our clever tricks. Yet these women had to cultivate a sort of almost monastic secrecy. Letters home were censored, casual conversations were monitored, and even the social graces that normally lubricate polite society were constrained by a constant, unspoken tension. Anything revealed could cost lives, could change the course of the war, could be catastrophic. and so they adapted. Part of this adaptation involved the creation of a very particular social code within Bletchley Park. Humor was dry, understated, and often very sardonic. Complaints were carefully phrased because one never knew who might be listening. Friendships existed, of course, but with an awareness that there were limits. A joke about one's own workload was fine. A joke about breaking enigma, less so. And yet, in this quiet environment, camaraderie flourished in unexpected ways. Women shared notes about daily inconveniences, recipes, and clothes, while simultaneously maintaining an unbreakable wall of secrecy around the very work that justified their presence. The women were recruited for their particular talents, though sometimes the process was, by modern standards, strangely arbitrary. Many were chosen because of their linguistic abilities, fluent in German, French, or Italian. Others were picked for mathematical skill, though at a time when mathematics, for women, was often considered unusual, impressive, or occasionally suspicious. And some were recruited simply because they could follow instructions meticulously, day after day, hour after hour, without error, without complaint. The latter may have been the most critical skill of all, and yet, despite their skill and discipline, the work was exhausting. Consider the bomb machines. They required careful setup, precise operation, and constant attention. Each machine contained dozens of rotating drums, wires, and connections. One misaligned drum, one careless note, and the results were useless. It was the kind of labor that encouraged a mild sort of obsession, a focus bordering on trance, because the smallest distraction could have ripple effects that mattered on a continental scale, and distractions were plentiful. Bletchley Park was, after all, still a human place, with meals delivered late, electricity flickering, and colleagues occasionally sneezing in that peculiar, distracting way that reminded everyone that they were, in fact, human. There was also the emotional labor, because the messages they decoded often contained information about military movements, troop casualties, and political maneuvers. The women of Bletchley Park were forced to internalize the horrors of war in the quietest possible way. They could not speak of these horrors. They could not commiserate openly. They could not, even in private letters, admit what they knew, and yet they absorbed it all, day after day, a steady undercurrent of grief, anxiety, and the awareness that their work, though invisible, was profoundly consequential. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story is how utterly effective their secrecy was. For 30 years after the war, the women of Bletchley Park did not speak. They married, had children, wrote letters, pursued careers, and aged, all without revealing what they had accomplished. This wasn't a matter of fear of government reprisal, though that was present. It was a matter of habit, of culture, and of a shared understanding that the secrecy was, itself, a moral and ethical imperative. To break it would have been unthinkable, almost like betraying one's own shadow. There are anecdotes of this silence that are almost comically disciplined. One woman, when asked about her work decades later by her grandchildren, reportedly smiled faintly and said, "I typed a lot of letters." Another, when prodded by friends, simply nodded and returned to the subject of knitting. The truth, the monumental, history-shaping truth, was locked behind decades of polite understatement, of quiet nods, of the unassuming heroism of those who understand that the most important work is often done where no one can see it. There were, of course, risks. The work was sensitive in the extreme. If anyone had leaked information, accidentally, ignorantly, or maliciously, it could have compromised entire operations. And yet, remarkably, no such breach occurred on a scale that mattered. This is partially a testament to the extraordinary discipline of the women, partially a testament to the structure of Bletchley Park itself, which compartmentalized knowledge carefully. Few people knew the full scope of the operations. Each person knew their piece, and only their piece. Like a vast, intricate mosaic, each small, tedious action contributed to a picture that only a few could ever see in its entirety. Let's consider the culture within Bletchley Park. It was hierarchical, naturally, but in a subtle, almost invisible way. Men often held the senior technical or administrative positions, though women frequently surpassed them in expertise and diligence. Yet recognition was rare. Titles were formal. Praise was formal. Achievement was quietly recorded, and then mostly forgotten in public memory. This quiet hierarchy reinforced the culture of secrecy. Everyone understood that the importance of the work was larger than personal ambition, ego, or the desire for social approval. The secrecy extended beyond the end of the war. For the women, life after Bletchley Park involved returning to ordinary roles: teaching, clerical work, family life, and domestic responsibilities. They were praised for ordinary achievements, while the extraordinary remained hidden. It wasn't that the war had ended their contributions. It was that history had been deliberately deferred, a silent acknowledgement that some stories are too sensitive, too dangerous, or too complex to share immediately. There was also a gendered aspect to the secrecy. Women were often conditioned to understate, to diminish, to avoid claiming credit. This cultural habit, combined with the official restrictions, ensured that the incredible work of Bletchley Park's female staff remained largely invisible. It was, in retrospect, a deeply unfair suppression of achievement, though at the time, it was simply the norm. Many women accepted this quietly, without complaint, because the alternative, disclosure, was considered morally and politically irresponsible. And yet, when the story finally emerged, decades later, the scale of their achievement was staggering. Tens of thousands of messages decrypted, countless lives saved, strategies foiled, and wars shortened, and all of it accomplished by people who had no expectation of fame, who worked in secrecy, and who understood, from the beginning, that the world would likely never know. It's worth drifting for a moment over the psychological toll of this kind of work. Imagine dedicating the prime years of your life to something monumental, knowing that your role must remain invisible. Imagine the relief of finally being able to breathe, even after decades of quiet vigilance, when the world learned what you had accomplished. And imagine the quiet amusement of realizing that your ordinary years at home, after the war, were punctuated by the extraordinary memory of work that had literally changed the course of history. Bletchley Park was, in essence, a school of subtle heroism. The women learned to live with secrecy, to operate in silence, to excel without acknowledgement. They learned to translate discipline into achievement, to convert monotony into impact, and to sustain moral clarity in the shadow of war. It is tempting to call this work invisible, but perhaps it is more accurate to call it profoundly understated. The machinery of history, after all, often depends on the quiet persistence of people no one remembers in the moment. And so, as we drift back into the imagined corridors of Bletchley Park, picture the quiet tapping of keys, the soft hum of machines, and the occasional, almost imperceptible sigh of exhaustion. Picture women huddled over papers, tracing patterns, connecting dots, calculating probabilities, all while understanding that a single misstep, a single word, could alter lives. And then picture them leaving the building each night, stepping into ordinary streets, engaging in ordinary conversation, while carrying the extraordinary weight of a war effort that remained invisible to the world. This is the paradox of Bletchley Park. Extraordinary work hidden in plain sight, monumental contributions made quietly, heroism defined by restraint. The invisible army did not march in parades. They did not appear in headlines. They did not expect medals, though some were eventually recognized decades later. They simply worked, tirelessly, invisibly, and with astonishing dedication, trusting that their small, quiet actions would ripple outward in ways they could not imagine. And it worked. For 30 years, the secret remained intact. Families never knew, friends never suspected. Casual acquaintances were left entirely unaware of the vast, intricate web of intelligence, mathematics, and human discipline that had been quietly maintained. The women of Bletchley Park carried their knowledge silently, often with a sense of pride muted by the constraints of secrecy, and with a humility born of the understanding that the work mattered more than recognition. Even when the world finally learned, the revelation was almost dreamlike. Headlines spoke of codebreakers and hidden heroes, but the reality was richer, subtler, and more profound. These were women who had mastered secrecy as both a skill and a moral imperative. They had internalized history in a way that was entirely personal, and they had done so with patience, intelligence, and the quiet humor that had been their constant companion throughout the war. So, as we drift from the corridors of Bletchley Park into the warm quiet of memory, it is worth reflecting on this extraordinary paradox. The most consequential contributions often occur where no one can see. The greatest heroes are sometimes the ones who do not march, do not announce themselves, and do not expect to be remembered. And yet, their work, like the invisible hum of a distant machine or the faint rhythm of fingers on keys, resonates across history, quietly, persistently, and unassumingly. The women of Bletchley Park exemplified this truth. They worked in silence, in shadows, and in secrecy. They mastered complexity and monotony in equal measure. They endured pressure, boredom, and the constant weight of responsibility. And they did it all with a quiet grace that is, in its own subtle way, almost sacred. And now, as we settle into the final soft reflection of this story, imagine the quiet corridors, the rhythmic clicking of keys, the hum of machines, the faint rustle of papers, and the whisper of minds at work. These were the invisible hands shaping history, unseen but utterly essential. And for 30 years, the world slept, unaware that its fate had quietly rested in the diligence, intelligence, and quiet heroism of this extraordinary, invisible army. And of Part 2, Part 3, the powder monkeys of the 18th century. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the creaking decks, salt-stung sails, and thunderous guns of the 18th century naval world. If you've ever wondered what it was like to live on a wooden ship, buffeted by wind and sea, while simultaneously trying not to be blown to bits by your own artillery, then settle into your blanket, wiggle your toes until they find a warm spot, and let your breathing ease into a soft rhythm. because we are about to meet a peculiar breed of young people who endured precisely that, mostly without much choice. They were called powder monkeys. The name is, of course, both literal and a little condescending. These were boys, sometimes as young as 9 or 10, often no older than 14, whose entire purpose on a ship was to carry gunpowder from the magazines below deck up to the cannons during battle. It was a job that demanded speed, coordination, and an almost absurd lack of fear. And yet, the world of the powder monkey was also monotonous, cramped, filthy, and occasionally, if you were lucky, mildly terrifying in the way that only a wooden vessel full of gunpowder and cannon fire can be. The role itself was conceived out of necessity. Naval ships of the era were enormous, cumbersome, and surprisingly inefficient. Cannons were heavy, powder barrels were even heavier, and battles required a constant, steady supply of ammunition. Adults, sailors, gunners, and officers were, naturally, expected to operate the guns, steer the ship, and shout orders. But running powder up from below? That could be entrusted to nimble hands, quick feet, and a certain willingness to risk life and limb for the sake of someone else's cannon salvo. Enter the powder monkey. These boys were, almost universally, orphans, apprentices, or children of sailors. Sometimes they were sons of officers, though this was rarer and often discouraged, because being a powder monkey was a job best done by those who could be easily replaced. Their uniforms were non-existent or minimal, consisting largely of whatever rags were on hand, occasionally supplemented with pieces of discarded adult clothing. They carried satchels of gunpowder, wooden buckets, or small kegs, depending on the ship's practice, and ran tirelessly, often barefoot, through the narrow corridors of the vessel. It is tempting, of course, to imagine these boys as energetic and heroic in some quaint, swashbuckling sense, but the reality was subtler, quieter, and, in its own way, profoundly tragic. Life aboard a warship was monotonous for everyone. The officers drank tea or rum, barked orders, and occasionally wrote letters home. Sailors swabbed decks, maintained rigging, or got seasick with extraordinary regularity. And the powder monkeys, meanwhile, existed in a perpetual state of readiness. Not quite children, not quite sailors, caught in a liminal world of danger and drudgery. Consider the environment itself. Ships of the line were crowded, dark, and smelly. Ropes chafed hands raw. The smell of salt and sweat mixed with tar, bilge water, and the faint tang of powder. A powder monkey navigating these corridors during battle would have to dodge swaying barrels, swinging ropes, and shouting sailors, all while carrying highly flammable cargo that, if spilled or struck by a spark, could obliterate not only him but everyone within a 20-foot radius. This was, by any measure, a job that demanded an unusual combination of courage, agility, and utter lack of awareness of one's own mortality. Training was minimal and often informal. Boys learned by watching others, following orders, and enduring repeated mistakes. There was no classroom. There were no instructional manuals, beyond perhaps a sailor's gruff advice. Keep it steady. Don't drop it. Don't get yourself killed. And yet, somehow, they succeeded, often, against all odds, because the alternative, slowly learning one's lesson the hard way, tended to be fatal. The social hierarchy aboard the ship dictated much of their daily experience. officers were distant, both in rank and physical location, and often intolerably solemn. Sailors might treat them as nuisances or, occasionally, as useful helpers, depending on mood, temperament, and whether the boy had spilled gunpowder that day. Discipline was harsh. Punishments were frequent, often painful, and occasionally arbitrary. A powder monkey might be caned, flogged, or sent to the bilge as a warning to others. And still, they ran their routes tirelessly, day after day, because survival depended on it. Food was basic, often barely sufficient to sustain life. Hardtack, salted meat, and occasionally a dubious vegetable were the main fare. Fresh water was scarce, and illnesses spread quickly. Powder monkeys were remarkably resilient, or perhaps remarkably accustomed to discomfort. And, in a way, this resilience was necessary, because life at sea required it, and because, naturally, no one else was going to look after them. During battles, the reality of the job became starkly clear. Cannons fired in rapid succession. The ship shook. Smoke filled the air. Orders were shouted over the din, and the boys ran, sometimes repeatedly up and down ladders, along narrow corridors, between barrels and rigging, delivering powder with almost frantic precision. Any hesitation, any dropped keg, any misstep could be fatal. And yet, in the midst of this chaos, the powder monkeys moved like shadows, unnoticed by the officers, respected only by those who understood the quiet skill required to survive. Interestingly, despite the danger, many powder monkeys reported a strange sort of pride in their work. They were part of the ship, integral to its function, and occasionally, when officers acknowledged them, which was rare, they were treated with a brief, almost perfunctory respect. In private, sailors might nod to them as they passed. In moments of calm, a boy might exchange a quiet word with a fellow powder monkey, sharing a joke, a complaint, or a small piece of candy. These tiny interactions were the only relief from the relentless rhythm of duty. Some boys remained powder monkeys for years, growing up within the ship's routines. Others were promoted, often to midshipmen or apprentices, if they survived long enough and displayed enough competence. Those who made it into adulthood sometimes continued naval careers, rising to ranks that would have been impossible in civilian life. Others returned to land, scarred physically and emotionally, carrying memories of smoke-filled battles, the constant peril of powder, and the faint pride of having contributed invisibly to history. The stories of individual powder monkeys are often fragmentary, preserved in letters, ship logs, and occasional anecdotes. One boy, known simply as Jack, reportedly carried powder across the deck during a storm so fierce that other sailors were clinging for their lives. Another, unnamed in the records, reportedly tripped while carrying a keg and narrowly avoided disaster when a fellow powder monkey caught the falling barrel mid-air, earning a nod from a captain who rarely smiled. Such moments were rare, brief, and mostly forgotten, but they were the threads of a quiet, heroic tapestry. And then there is the matter of what became of them. Many, naturally, did not survive long enough to retire. Disease, injury, and accidents claimed their share, as did the inevitable recklessness of youth in a world built on risk and rationing. Those who survived faced the challenge of reintegration into society. Few had formal education. Many bore physical scars, burns, limps, missing fingers, that marked them as veterans of a warlike childhood. And yet, despite these hardships, Some went on to lead lives that were, in their own way, ordinary: farming, clerking, apprenticing, marrying, having children, and occasionally telling tales of smoke and powder around the hearth, carefully edited for dramatic effect or brevity. The broader context of their existence is also worth noting. Powder monkeys were, in some sense, victims of circumstance. Societal norms permitted children to be employed in dangerous work, often in conditions that would be considered unthinkable today. Poverty, family loss, and the exigencies of naval warfare combined to create an environment where risk was accepted as inevitable. And yet, the resilience, intelligence, and agility of these boys turned a dangerous necessity into a quietly heroic tradition. Over time, the role of powder monkeys diminished. Ships changed. Technology improved. Larger, more efficient powder handling systems reduced the need for small, quick-footed carriers. By the late 18th century, naval reforms and industrial innovations gradually phased out the youngest boys from the most dangerous work. Those who remained found themselves in a world that still demanded skill, but offered slightly more protection and training. And yet, the legend of the powder monkey endured, preserved in naval lore, novels, and eventually, historical study. In reflecting on their lives, it is tempting to romanticize the powder monkeys, to imagine them as swashbuckling, fearless heroes who bounded across decks with heroic grace. But the truth is more subtle, quieter, and in its own way, more profound. These were children forced to grow up fast, learning discipline, courage, and ingenuity under circumstances that demanded everything of them. Their heroism was not loud or celebrated. It was practical, relentless, and often invisible. And so, as we drift away from the gun decks, the smoke, and the narrow corridors of these wooden ships, imagine the soft rhythm of small feet running across planks, the muffled clank of powder kegs, and the quiet concentration of boys tasked with responsibilities far beyond their years. They were, in the most literal sense, carriers of fire, and in the most figurative, carriers of history. Their lives remind us that heroism is often hidden in plain sight, that courage can be quiet, and that sometimes the most remarkable people are those whose names are barely recorded at all. In the end, powder monkeys lived in a liminal space between childhood and adulthood, between peril and routine, between invisibility and historical importance. They existed largely without recognition, survived largely through cunning and endurance, and contributed quietly, persistently, and effectively to the machinery of war. Their stories are scattered, fragmentary, and often overlooked. And yet, when we consider the rhythm of life aboard an 18th century naval vessel, the smoke, the gunpowder, the sound of orders shouted over the wind, it becomes clear that without them, history might have been just slightly less dramatic, slightly slower, and slightly more catastrophic. And now, as we settle into the soft close of this reflection, picture a quiet evening on a ship at sea, the cannons silent, the powder safely stored, and the boys, now resting, perhaps staring at the stars through a small hatch, dreaming of a life beyond the planks. Their day has ended, their work is done, and the world continues, largely unaware of the invisible hands that have kept it moving, firing, and alive. End of Part 3. Part 4. The Jester's Life in the Court of a Mad King. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the flickering candlelight and heavy tapestries of an old royal court, where the air smelled of wine, sweat, and fear in almost equal measure. Let your shoulders relax, dim the lights, if you haven't already, and let your mind drift into a quieter, slightly absurd world. A world where humor could be both a shield and a noose, and where survival often depended on having the wit to make someone laugh just enough, but not so much as to provoke a sudden and unpredictable fury. We are about to meet the court jester. The position of jester, of course, has always been a curious one. In theory, they were entertainers. In practice, they were the safety valve of absolute power, the only person in the court allowed to speak truths in disguise, and occasionally, the most at-risk individual when the king's moods turned sour under a mad king, by which I mean one of those rulers whose idea of governance alternated unpredictably between paranoia, exuberant whim, and occasional bouts of frightening clarity. The life of a jester was both precarious and endlessly fascinating. The jester's day began, like that of most court attendants, with a careful reading of the king's temper. This was the true skill, far beyond juggling, singing, or telling clever stories. Every footfall in the hall, every whispered rumor, every minor gesture could signal the king's mood. Was he irritable? Was he melancholic? Or, perhaps worst of all, was he deliriously joyous and therefore liable to make sudden, absurd demands? A skilled jester could navigate this subtle emotional landscape with almost surgical precision, a blend of intuition, observation, and a touch of instinct that verged on the supernatural. Breakfast, when it happened, was a quiet affair. The king's table might be lavish, overflowing with breads, meats, and fruits, though the choice of dishes could be subject to the monarch's whims. One day, the king might insist that the jester taste a particular pastry first. The next, he might throw the plate across the room simply to test the jester's reflexes. Meals, therefore, were both nourishment and rehearsal. The jester had to be nimble, alert, and prepared for sudden improvisation. Spilled wine or a misjudged gesture could be taken as an insult, or, in more generous moods, as comic timing gone awry. Jesters were often drawn from unusual backgrounds. Some were the illegitimate children of minor nobility, others were performers from traveling troupes, and some were simply exceptionally clever peasants who had been noticed in a marketplace or festival. Their training was less formal than that of a court musician or a scribe. It consisted largely of observation, mimicry, and trial by fire, or, in this case, trial by monarch. They learned which gestures elicited laughter, which stories avoided offense, and which jokes could survive close scrutiny by people who wielded absolute power. The daily work of a jester, when there were no crises, might seem gentle in retrospect. Juggling, storytelling, performing physical comedy, singing, or playing musical instruments. But these seemingly innocuous tasks carried a heavier weight than one might imagine. Each performance was not merely for amusement. It was, subtly, an act of political navigation. A jester who could amuse the king without angering him preserved not only his own life, but sometimes the stability of entire factions within the court. Conversely, a poorly judged quip could provoke wrath that might echo through corridors, drawing officers, courtiers, and guards into a brief and terrifying maelstrom of fear and confusion. The king's madness, of course, took many forms. In some periods, he might speak to invisible audiences, offering elaborate soliloquies or imaginary decrees. In others, he might summon members of the court to stand silently for hours while he inspected them, or command the jester to perform absurd rituals meant to test loyalty or attention. The jester's role was to participate without overstepping, to amuse without provoking, to obey without capitulating to cruelty. It was a delicate balance. One misstep could be fatal, one hesitation fatal to decorum, and one excessive flourish fatal to the performer. One notable aspect of the jester's work was the constant need for improvisation. Scripts were rare. Even prepared pieces had to be adjusted on the fly to accommodate the king's shifting mood. A jest that earned roars of laughter one day might fall flat, or provoke outrage the next. Some jesters carried small prop bags with familiar objects, bells, simple masks, tiny musical instruments, or pieces of cloth that could be fashioned into comical hats. The props were not merely for amusement. They were tools of survival, instruments of diversion, and sometimes, surprisingly, tools of subtle subversion. Jesters often became confidants of a sort, though always in the strangest, most precarious way, because the king's moods were unpredictable, and because the king rarely trusted anyone else completely. A jester might find himself listening to secrets or observations that could, in other circumstances, cost someone dearly. The key was in presentation. A jest could mask criticism, exaggeration, or suggestion. A jester might point out flaws in governance under the guise of comedy, or highlight dangerous tendencies of nobles in a story about imaginary animals. The genius lay in delivering truth in a cloak of nonsense, allowing the king to digest the message without recognizing its substance until it was too late, or, occasionally, not at all. Despite the dangers, jesters often held an unusual form of power. Their proximity to the king afforded them glimpses of decision-making that few others could claim. They could, subtly, influence moods, nudge opinions, or distract the monarch from imprudent impulses. Yet this power was invisible and precarious. Unlike ministers or officers, who could wield influence openly, the jester's authority was contingent on humor, timing, and grace. A misjudged performance could erase years of earned trust, while a well-timed joke might grant a small measure of sway over royal impulses. The personal lives of court jesters were often strange blends of freedom and constraint. On the one hand, they were frequently tolerated in ways that other servants were not, permitted a certain mobility, informal dress, and private time that more rigidly structured roles did not allow. On the other hand, their existence was circumscribed by the whims of the king. Travel, marriage, or even friendships could be regulated by proximity to the court. Many jesters remained unmarried or married late, often to women who understood or endured the peculiarities of life under royal scrutiny. Health was another concern. Life at court was physically demanding despite appearances. Jesters often engaged in physically strenuous activities, tumbling, dancing, performing acrobatics, and carrying props, coupled with irregular meals, long hours of observation, and frequent exposure to alcohol, smoke, and the general discomforts of a medieval court. The role could be exhausting, yet many jesters survived well into adulthood, developing a hardiness born of necessity, and a capacity to endure both the absurd and the terrifying with remarkable equanimity. The psychological toll, however, was subtle but profound. To maintain constant alertness while presenting an appearance of levity required immense mental discipline. The jester's mind became a perpetual game board, calculating risk, timing, and emotional response. They learned to read the smallest signs, the way a monarch's hand trembled, the flicker of the eye, a sudden tightening of the jaw. These were cues, vital and persistent, guiding every word, gesture, and expression. Sleep, when it came, was often light, interrupted by nightmares of missteps or imagined punishments. And yet, through all this, the jester maintained a semblance of humor, a public face of comedy masking a private vigilance. There were, of course, moments of triumph. A well-received performance could earn praise, gifts, or even temporary favor that lasted long after the laughter had subsided. Some jesters became beloved figures within the court, almost mythologized for their cleverness, their courage, or their uncanny ability to amuse a monarch teetering on the edge of rationality. Stories circulated of jesters who, through wit and timing, defused potentially lethal situations, or persuaded the king to reconsider ill-advised policies. These small victories were rarely acknowledged in formal histories, but they mattered deeply, both to the survival of the jester and to the functioning of the court itself. Yet the danger was ever present. Historical accounts tell of jesters who overstepped, who misjudged tone or insulted the wrong noble, and who were punished swiftly and sometimes brutally. A jest misinterpreted could lead to exile, imprisonment, or death, and in a court dominated by a mad king, the line between acceptable risk and fatal misstep was extraordinarily thin. Survival, therefore, demanded constant attentiveness, impeccable timing, and a willingness to laugh while the ground beneath your feet seemed perpetually uncertain. The material surroundings of a jester also shaped the experience. Court halls were often lavish, but rigidly structured. Heavy tapestries, gilt furniture, and polished floors contrasted sharply with the dirt and grime of daily existence. Candles flickered, producing shadows that danced across walls in unpredictable patterns, enhancing both the drama and the absurdity of performance. Jesters used these elements, tapestry folds, floor patterns, shadows, to accentuate their routines, exploiting every available detail to distract, amuse, and survive. Travel was another peculiar aspect. A jester might accompany the king on journeys, both domestic and foreign, often in uncomfortable or dangerous circumstances. Carriages, horseback, or even riverboats presented challenges, not only physically, but in terms of performance. The jester's audience remained the same, unpredictable, and sometimes capricious. Foreign diplomats and local dignitaries might see only the jester's antics, unaware of the delicate political navigation happening behind the laughter. In this way, the jester acted as both entertainer and subtle diplomat, a performer who carried influence in disguise. At the end of the day, when the court settled and the king retired to private chambers, the jester often lingered, tidying props, rehearsing tomorrow's routines, and reflecting on the day's delicate maneuvers. Many wrote letters or kept small journals, noting observations that might, someday, serve as historical records, or at least provide material for future jokes. These reflections were quiet, thoughtful, and often tinged with a sense of endurance, an understanding that their work was simultaneously trivial and essential, comic and profoundly serious. In the long view, jesters remind us that history is not only shaped by kings, queens, and generals. It is shaped by those who navigate peril with subtlety, those who survive by intellect and agility, those who balance humor and survival in equal measure. A jester in the court of a mad king was more than a performer. He was a strategist, an observer, a confidant, and occasionally a quiet hero. His life was precarious, his tasks absurd, and his rewards fleeting. Yet in the delicate balance of amusement and danger, he ensured that the machinery of royal madness could continue without catastrophic collapse. And as we drift away from the flickering halls and the cautious steps of a clever boy or man in motley, imagine the soft shuffle of feet, the gentle tinkle of a bell, the quiet murmur of a joke delivered perfectly at the edge of peril. The court sleeps, the king dreams, and the jester, ever vigilant, rests lightly, preparing to navigate another day of absurdity, danger, and the faint, enduring power of laughter in a world ruled by madness. End of Part 4. Part 5. Roman Legionaries on Leave. Life Beyond the March. Hey, everyone. Tonight we're drifting back through time to the dusty roads and sun-baked forts of the Roman Empire. Let your shoulders relax. Settle into your blanket. Picture the sun lowering over the distant hills of Gaul or Britannia, the soft chatter of local townsfolk mingling with the occasional clatter of military boots. We're about to follow a Roman legionary, not on the battlefield, but on a day when the gladius rests. The shield leans against the barracks wall, and the soldier, for a few precious hours, can remember that life might exist outside the endless march and the rigid discipline of the camp. A Roman legionary's day off, or what the army politely called recreation, was, as one might expect, a carefully structured opportunity to forget, briefly, that his entire life was regimented, catalogued, and owned by the state. Legionaries were remarkable humans, in a way, hardened by years of training, drilling, and the relentless monotony of marching, yet still capable of small pleasures, fleeting indulgences, and the occasional taste of freedom, if only for a day. Most days off were dictated by circumstance. Sometimes the emperor, or a provincial governor, declared a holiday to celebrate a victory, a religious festival, or even just a particularly fortunate alignment of Jupiter. Other times, a day off was a reward for good behavior, or an unofficial reprieve during long stretches between battles, and sometimes it simply arrived because the legionary had successfully survived another week of discipline, mud, and marching, and the centurion, in an unusually merciful mood, allowed him a brief interval of liberty. The first act for many legionaries was simple: rest. Barracks in Roman forts were not luxurious. They were long, rectangular buildings, often stone or timber, with narrow beds and little in the way of comfort. The legionary might stretch out on his mat, perhaps with a thin blanket if the winter chill had bitten, and let the sounds of the camp, the distant clinking of armor, the murmur of fellow soldiers, the occasional bark of a dog, wash over him without requiring action. Sleep, when it came, was heavy and undisturbed, an unremarkable yet precious luxury. But rest alone did not fill the hours of liberty. Legionaries were curious, surprisingly human creatures, and the world beyond the fort walls was both strange and fascinating. In foreign provinces, everything carried a hint of novelty: unfamiliar smells, odd foods, and the language of local townsfolk, which was often incomprehensible, yet endlessly entertaining. Soldiers wandered along dirt roads and stone streets, inspecting markets, wandering into taverns, or simply watching local children chase each other across the plaza. their laughter echoing oddly across the stone walls. Taverns were a particular fascination. They were seldom quiet and rarely sanitary, but they offered a wealth of sensory experience. Legionaries could sample local wine, often watered down, occasionally fermented to an alarming degree, and eat foods that were unfamiliar but comforting: bread, olives, salted fish, stews flavored with herbs that smelled exotic and suspiciously pungent. Tavern keepers often treated soldiers with a mixture of reverence and wariness. After all, these men carried weapons, discipline, and an unpredictable temper. The legionary, meanwhile, marveled at the novelty of conversation, the texture of unfamiliar cheeses, or the spectacle of local entertainment, which might include musicians, acrobats, or occasionally someone singing in a language the soldier only half understood. Some legionaries were more industrious. They traded goods, bartered with locals, or attempted minor crafts. A soldier might learn a trick from a local potter, or dabble in small-scale metalwork, creating items for personal use or small gifts to send back home. These activities, seemingly mundane, offered a measure of mental engagement that the repetitive drills of the fort could not provide. It was, in essence, a kind of intellectual exercise wrapped in the guise of leisure. Letters were another important activity. Many legionaries maintained correspondence with family, lovers, or friends back in Rome or in their home provinces. Writing materials were simple: wax tablets, ink, and reed pens. But the act of writing was deeply meaningful. Letters offered connection, a tether to a world beyond the mud and stone of the fort, and a chance to record, however briefly, thoughts about life, duty, or the occasional absurdity of military bureaucracy. A day off might be spent composing a particularly thoughtful note, correcting a minor mistake in a previous missive, or crafting a message that balanced flattery, complaint, and longing, all within the constraints of a few waxed lines. Exercise was also part of the day. Soldiers were, after all, trained to be fit and disciplined. They might spar with each other, practice swordplay with wooden gladi, or race across the fields to burn off excess energy. This was not merely idle play. It was both training and entertainment, a blend of duty and amusement. And sometimes, when a particularly daring soldier had a day of bold initiative, the exercise would spill into organized games or small competitions, such as archery contests, mock skirmishes, or relays with crude obstacle courses. These events were taken seriously, though the consequences were seldom fatal, unless someone forgot for a moment the fragility of a human nose. Religion played a quiet but essential role. Even on days off, many soldiers attended local shrines, temples, or sacred sites. The Romans were both pragmatic and superstitious, and foreign provinces offered a cornucopia of new deities, rituals, and omens. The legionary might perform a simple sacrifice, leave a small coin in an altar, or offer a whispered prayer for protection, health, or luck. This engagement with religion was rarely dogmatic, often pragmatic, and sometimes deeply personal, a quiet acknowledgement of forces beyond his control, framed by curiosity and a cautious respect for local traditions. And then there were moments of idleness, which were, in fact, essential. Soldiers lounged in the sun, watched the comings and goings of villagers, or simply lay in the grass listening to the sounds of a world untouched by marching orders or battle plans. Birds, wind in the trees, distant bells or horns These were subtle luxuries, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly restorative. The legionary, in these quiet interludes, allowed his mind to wander, to imagine distant places, or to recall memories from childhood, family, or past campaigns. Romantic encounters, when available, were another facet of leisure. Soldiers were young, spirited, and frequently far from home. Relationships, brief, intense, and often fleeting, provided human contact that balanced the rigor of military life. Courting might involve a shy exchange of glances, a clumsy attempt at conversation, or a shared meal. Sometimes affection was physical, sometimes merely social, and often ephemeral. These connections, however brief, offered reassurance that life, in some form, continued beyond the rigid discipline of legionary existence. Of course, not every legionary spent his day off in refinement or exploration. Gambling was common, often with dice, knucklebones, or small tokens. Wagers could be modest, a coin, a bit of bread, or more ambitious, involving prized possessions or personal wagers. Gambling was dangerous in its own way. It could incite quarrels, provoke guards, or reveal latent rivalries. Yet it was thrilling, and perhaps that small thrill of risk was an echo of the danger ever present in a soldier's life. Music was another constant companion. Many legionaries carried small instruments, or learned to mimic songs from other provinces. Drums, flutes, and simple string instruments were common. Music offered both entertainment and solace, a way to punctuate the day with rhythm and melody. Soldiers might gather in small groups, sharing songs, chants, or local melodies they had picked up during campaigns. Singing served as both amusement and memory, a way to link distant lands, comrades, and the long, often lonely path of military life. Meals, again, punctuated the day. A soldier might dine in the fort, but more often, he sought the novelty of local taverns, bakeries, or street vendors. He might discover a local preparation of cheese, or a type of bread unlike anything in Rome. Food, while simple, carried significance. Every flavor, every texture, was a reminder of the world beyond ranks, reports, and inspections. It was a subtle reminder that life could be experienced, not merely endured. And then there was observation. Soldiers were trained to notice, to catalog, and to remember. On a day off, they still practiced this habit, though more casually. They watched the behaviors of locals, the patterns of trade, the rhythms of daily life. This observation was sometimes mundane, the way a child balanced a basket, the way a baker rotated his dough. Sometimes it was more strategic, noting the layout of streets, the strength of a wall, the location of gates. The legionary's mind never truly rested. Even leisure was imbued with a sense of purpose. Evening brought quieter activities. Soldiers might gather around small fires, exchanging stories of campaigns, recounting battles, or embellishing feats of bravery and folly. The stories were sometimes exaggerated, sometimes poignant, and sometimes painfully comic. Humor served both to bond the men and to soothe the nerves frayed by long campaigns. Laughter, when shared, became both medicine and ritual, a gentle reprieve from the harshness of martial life. As night fell, the legionary returned to the fort, often reflecting on the day's small discoveries, amusements, and encounters. He might clean his equipment, write letters, or simply lie on his mat listening to the distant sounds of the province, the wind in the trees, the murmur of water, the occasional cry of an animal. These quiet moments, fleeting and fragile, were treasured. They offered perspective, grounding, and a reminder that beyond the discipline, the orders, and the constant threat of combat, there existed a world worth noting, remembering, and sometimes simply enjoying. Days off for a Roman legionary were not idle or frivolous. They were a delicate interlude between duty and danger, between service and survival, between the constant regiment of military life and the faint, tantalizing taste of freedom. They were moments in which the soldier could, however briefly, explore curiosity, engage socially, enjoy sensory pleasures, and reaffirm connections to a broader human experience. And while history often remembers battles, tactics, and campaigns, it is in these small, quiet interludes, the mundane and the fleeting, that we glimpse the true texture of a soldier's life. So, as we drift away from the dusty roads, the taverns, the laughing children, and the warm fires of the evening, imagine the legionary laying down, gladius at his side, shield leaning against the wall. The day's experiences sink into memory, the mind relaxes, and sleep arrives, not as an obligation, but as a natural consequence of a life lived between duty and fleeting freedom. Tomorrow, he will march again. Tomorrow, orders will arrive, drills will begin, and the world will demand obedience. But tonight, he rests, quietly, peacefully, and in those precious hours, the soldier is simply human. Good night.